Good afternoon, everyone. We are anticipating about 35 people joining, and right now we have 29. So let's give folks another minute or so, and we're gonna get started. Thank you.
Connie?
Yes.
Did you see Bing's message that he needs the code?
He needs what?
The code to get in?
Ken, would you help me, please?
Yeah, well,
Sure. I don't know if I have Bing's email though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I have Bing's email.
Okay. Suk, do you happen to have his email address?
I'll look.
Because I was gonna get started.
Yep.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Suk, you can share the code that you joined in with him. The Zoom link that you got. You can share that with him.
Nobody.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 1:02, I'm sorry. So we're gonna get started. Welcome to Conversations with Asian Americans in Michigan, Voices from the Midwest. Oops, I'm sorry, Bing is calling me here. Bing Suk is sending you the code to get in, okay? All right, thank you. My apologies. So again, welcome to Conversations with Asian Americans in Michigan, Voices from the Midwest Writers. This event is part of Grand Valley's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Celebration. I'm Connie Dang, and I work in the Vice President Office of Inclusion and Equity, and I serve as Senior Inclusion and Equity Officer. I believe my boss is joining us today in the room, Jessie Bonal. I am so honored to welcome one of the book's editors and 3 contributors of the book. If you haven't seen it, Asian Americans in Michigan, Voices from the Midwest. So before I introduce the speakers, I would like to bring to your attention that this book has been selected by Bridge, Michigan, a nonprofit news organization, as one of the 15 anti-racist Michigan books to read during quarantine. The book was published in March 2015. The 2 editors, Sook Wilkinson and Victor Chu, have assembled 41 contributors to give an intimate glimpse into Michigan's Asian American perspectives, including first-generation immigrants, those born in the United States, and 3rd and 4th generation Americans of Asian heritage. The vibrant and diverse contributors trace their ancestries back to East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Hmong. This book makes clear the contributions by individuals in many fields, including art, business, education, religion, sports, medicine, and politics, and demonstrates the central role of community organizations in bringing ethnic groups together and preserving memories. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce some of the writers of the book. Sook Wilkinson. Sook was recently appointed as commissioner of the new Protect Michigan Commission, a board member of Michigan School of Psychology, and board member of Historical Society of Michigan. Joseph Galura is currently working at University of Michigan School of Social Work as lecturer and advisor. Emily Hsiao is the head of economic product development at Indigo Agriculture. And last but not least, Sam Singh, Chief Executive Officer of Public Policy Associates. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And I also want to recognize a special guest in the house today. Mr. David Roden is Honorary Consul for the Republic of Korea in Michigan. So Mr. Roden, thank you for joining us today. Okay, so a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please mute your audio during the presentation if you haven't done so. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them anytime in the chat box, and we will take your questions during Q&As in the order they were received. And with that, I would like to begin with Suk. Suk, are you ready?
I am.
Okay. Suk, you are a co-editor of the book with Victor Chu, and you also wrote an essay, Political Engagement of Michigan Asian Americans. So according to the 2010 census, Asian American was the fastest growing population in Michigan. Suk, to provide context for our conversation today, could you give us an idea of the growing number of Asian American population in Michigan? And also, I think it would be interesting for the audience to know what city in Michigan has the highest percentage of Asian Americans.
I will do that. Thank you so much, Connie, for organizing this conversation. And also thank your 8 other co-sponsors from GVSU as well. So thank you so much. And also thank all the writers, the speakers, and the participants as well. Yes, the Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the United States. And like Connie said, in Michigan, the Asian American population is about 3.4%. And in the Tri-County area, including Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb, Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group. So I would actually like to pose a question to the participants. Which of these 3 cities do you think have the highest highest percentage of Asian Americans? Ann Arbor, Novi, Troy. Actually, I'm going to include a 4th one, Hamtramck. Just quick show of hand if you think it is Ann Arbor that has the highest. Quick show of hand, anybody? Can you see the show of hand, Connie?
Or you can type your answer in the chat box as well. Yeah,
right. So just to move things along, I see Ann Arbor, Novi, very close. But the highest percentage, Troy is the winner with 13+ percentage. And then next is Ann Arbor, and then Novi. And some of you may wonder, why Hamtramck? Hamtramck actually has a very big percentage of Bangladeshi community there. So Hamtramck comes in 4th. So along with that, if I could just take a few minutes to talk about, just to make a few comments. So on the first page of the book that Connie showed you, you'll read the introduction written by Frank Wu. He was the dean of Wayne State University Law School, and then went on and now is the president of Queens College within City University of New York. And he starts his comment by saying, I wish I could have read this book when I was growing up in Metro Detroit in the 70s. Well, in 1982, when Vincent Chin was killed, I was just a newcomer to Michigan, busy with my work as a clinical psychologist and a mother of 2 very young children. And I knew a few Koreans, but didn't know any other Asians. And his death and the legal injustice dealt to him was incomprehensible to me when the 2 men who killed him were fined $3,000 and served a 3-year probation, but not 1 day of jail time. We had an economic downturn at that time, and the auto industry was struggling, and they blamed the rise of Japanese cars for the struggle. And there was a strong anti-Japanese sentiment. It was a dangerous time to have an Asian face. Personally, I also felt unsafe and unprotected. And what his death taught me right away was that random people I run into couldn't tell or didn't care that I was Korean. And to them, I was just another Asian face. And like Frank Wu, I also wish I could have read the book, than to help me deal with what happened to Vincent Chin. And that's why I dedicated the book to the memory of Vincent Chin. So now we are in 2021. And in this very challenging time of COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn, again, I feel unsafe and unprotected. Hate crimes against the Asian Americans are increasing, as I'm sure you have been reading. The term Asian American was coined in 1968 by an American activist and historian Yuji Ichioka, a professor at UCLA. And his intention was to build a broad and collective identity for Asian Americans in order to band together to combat injustice. And even with a growing population, Asian Americans remain an invisible minority. So I urge you, every single one of you, to use your voice and make us more visible through your action and participation in voting and social justice issues. And there's no better time than now for all of us to come together as fellow Americans to fight against any kind of injustice. So thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Suk, for mentioning about Vincent Chin. I also want to recognize that we have Curtis Chin. Can you wave your hand so people can see you? So Curtis Chin is writer and movie producer of the documentary video Vincent Who. So if you would like to know more about Vincent Chin, please check that out. So thank you. So the next question that I have for you is, although Asian population has grown over the years, the political engagement of Asian Americans is still lagging. So could you talk about the importance for Asian Americans, not only having a seat at the table, but also having a voice in decision-making process at any levels?
Absolutely, that is just so critical. And that's why all of us need to step up and participate as much as possible. When Governor Granholm created the Governor's Advisory Council on Asian Americans, we realized that there was really no one voice that was representing the Asian American voice. And from there, we also realized that with the change of governorship, the Governor's Advisory Council was going to just disappear, and we weren't going to have any representation. And all the members of the Governor's Advisory Council at that time worked really, really hard with the legislators to create a permanent entity, which is now called MAPAC, Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission. So it's up to all of us, really, up to all of you to step up and make sure that we claim our voice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Suk. So now I would like to bring up Joe Galura. Joe, you co-wrote the essay, A Brief History of Filipino Americans in Michigan with Emily Lawson. Can you talk about how your family history aligns with your essay?
Sure. So let me screen share. All right. So I thought I would open with a quote. This is my cousin Norma. She was, of course, a Filipino nurse. She immigrated to Detroit in the 1960s. And she said to me when I started teaching at the University of Michigan, "You teach at the University of Michigan, cousin. What could be better than that?" Right? And she wasn't talking about last night's basketball game, right? If you can see the meme that I've got on the screen, right? It says, the first Filipino students in America enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1901, right? 1901. And if you can read the person in the middle, Santiago Arteaga, right? There's actually a 50-year archive at the University of Michigan. So my cousin Norma was a nurse. Santiago was an engineer, right? 50 years he writes back and forth with the dean of the College of Engineering because he has a really distinguished public service career. He becomes the civil engineer of Manila, a multiple-term mayor, provincial governor, college professor, dean of a college, right? In fact, if you read the correspondence, and this tells you a little bit about what I do in my spare time, but if you read the correspondence, right, he says to the dean, "Can you get me an honorary doctorate?" Right? The dean writes back, "Well, you are the one that has traveled the furthest for our class reunions," right? And then eventually, right, it's like, "Oh, Michigan just won the Rose Bowl. Can you send us the game film? Send it to Manila, mark it educational materials," right? Because there's this big alumni group that wants to have this viewing party in Manila. Now, I hope I've raised the question of why does the University of Michigan have such an extensive archive about Filipinos, right? And also a little bit about the contents, right? So one of the reasons why, right, and this is in my chapter, that starting in 1876, this is 20 years before the Spanish-American War, the university was doing research in the Philippines. Now, let me give you a glimpse of what some of that research looks like, I think. Okay, so one name you should know is Dean Conat Wurster, right? He went from being a researcher to being key colonial administrator after the Spanish-American War. He was Secretary of the Interior. He was in charge of education for the entire Philippines, which again is part of how so many of the best and brightest Filipinos ended up at the University of Michigan. Now, to paraphrase Mark Twain, America envisioned itself as bestowing the blessings of civilization to our little brown brothers who dwelt in darkness. There are literally thousands of these images, which Wurster used to justify the benevolent assimilation, that is, the remaking of the Philippines, as Stanley Kurnow would later write, in our being the U.S. image. So as I'll conclude later, right, there's this obvious proximity to whiteness in this colonial gaze, right? So kind of a contemporary note, and I don't know if we'll get to this today, but there's growing conversation around the need to decolonize ourselves, right? And actually at the university, there's this conversation about decolonizing our archives. So Wurster, pioneer in the use of photography as ethnographic research, but also as the move amongst Filipinos to decolonize themselves, right? So one thing that the archivists, a request that they get, right, is, so can we have some of these records so that we can recreate the tattoos of our region from earlier generations, again, as a way to kind of decolonize. Now, let me jump from the Spanish-American War to World War II and more of my family history, right? So this is favorite picture of my dad with his brother, Detroit, 1930, Belle Isle, right? right? If you're from Detroit, you may actually recognize the Scott Fountain, right? And the story is, right, they had been in Detroit for a year and they sent this picture to my grandmother, right? We're doing okay, right? And so on the one hand, right, you go to the Colonial Archives at the University of Michigan and you get the best and the brightest, the pensionados, the Barber scholars, right? Folk that were sent to the university to learn, some discipline and then, become part of the colonial administration. Not represented in the archives are self-supporting students like my father, my uncle, a lot of the people that I wrote about in the chapter, right? Let's see. They took advantage of their immigration status as when the Philippines was a colony and came to the U.S. Right, first to Hawaii, and then to Michigan and the booming auto industry, right? And whereas during World War II, a lot of Filipinos volunteered to fight in World War II. Right? My father's running joke was I was too short. But really what happened was self-supporting student who went to University of Detroit, his co-op turned into working for the defense industry, and he was a production engineer during World War II. I juxtapose my dad and my uncle with Frank Murphy, who is not Filipino, but who was mayor of Detroit during the time of this picture. He went from being mayor of Detroit to governor general of the Philippines, right? Which again, there's this massive colonial archive at the university around Murphy and his work in the Philippines. He was the last colonial governor, right? And kind of paved the way for Philippine independence. He then becomes, right, and Suk mentions, right, the long history of anti-Asian racism. He then goes to become a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he's the one who writes the dissent to the Korematsu case around the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. He's the first one, right, that actually says racism, right, in his decisions. And he's from Michigan. He's an alumni of the U of M Law School and undergrad. And there is also an extensive archive in Harbor Springs, right? And the Filipino American community there is cataloging that archive. Jumping ahead, right? So prior to writing the chapter for Suk's book, right, I also, with Emily Lawson, wrote another book, Filipino Women in Detroit, 1945 to 1955. Right, this is my mother's peer group, and that's my mother on the side. She's the single woman who came to Detroit to study clinical dietetics right after World War II. She meets my father, right? And they try to buy a house in Detroit. This is kind of a key story in Filipino women in Detroit. As people of color in the 1950s, right, they discover firsthand, right, redlining, racial discrimination. And I have at least one student on this call, and she's heard me say this in class, right? I juxtapose this with Martin Luther King, who gave his I Had a Dream speech. He premieres it in Detroit. And his special line for the Detroit audience is about housing discrimination, right? And the research that Emily and I did say, wait, there was anti-Asian housing discrimination at least 5 years in several documented cases before the I Have the Dream speech. So I also say that maybe it's not an accident, right, that I teach social work, right, a profession with the core value of social justice. One last fast forward. So another picture of my mom, right? That's her in the corner. And I have her attending a class, right? So there's now a Filipino American community center in Michigan. And the last part of this continuing story, right? So my mother's group, and actually the groups before that, formed community organizations, formed mutual aid societies, right? And at PACCM, that actually houses over 50 Filipino American community groups, right? And then a specific contribution that Emily Lawson and I made is there's a National Filipino American Historical Society. We chartered the Detroit chapter, and then the Michigan chapter. The Michigan chapter sponsors a weekly class at the Language and Culture School, Paralang Filipino, at PACCM, right? And so we sponsor a weekly class around Filipino American history, right? And it's intentionally intergenerational. And part of why I showed this picture of my mom, you know, even though she passed away 5 years ago, right? She loved attending those classes, those seminars. She is next to a graduate student who I sponsored her internship, who became one of the first teachers of this intergenerational class. One of her students, right, is now a teacher, a member of the PACCM board, and a documentary filmmaker who does stuff around Asian transnational adoption. James Benny Wilson, who I think Suk and many of you may know. Right? I just wanted to underscore, right, how important it is, right, for within our communities to do this intergenerational work, so that the stories, the lessons, the struggles, right, people know them across generations. Right, let me stop there. I just want to suggest that when we then go to consider contemporary issues facing our communities, we also need to locate ourselves and our family history within an evolving framework of intergenerational, multicultural, even anti-racist practice. So let me stop there.
Joe, thank you so much for sharing your family story and history. The struggles are real in all communities of color, and your story has helped to deconstruct the Mado minority myth that is so prevalent in the Asian community. So thank you for that. Now I would like to bring up Emily Hsiao. Joe, if you could, yes, thank you so much. So Emily, your essay, Unconscious and Unrecognized, continues to be relevant and important in today's society. In your essay, you raised awareness about racial discrimination and hate against Asian Americans and call attention to, and I quote you, "It's time for action." So how has your perspective shifted or changed since the writing of your story about 6 years ago?
Thanks, Connie. So one thing that I think is very interesting is I wrote this essay, I would say actually 15 years ago. So I was a freshman in high school, and I had just started to become much more aware of the microaggressions towards Asian Americans in school at the time. And I appreciate, Suk, that you brought up the introduction by Frank Wu, because at the time I was very influenced by Frank Wu's book Yellow, and the story of Vincent Chin. And in the piece, I talk a lot about the microaggression faced at school, as well as how certain terms such as the model minority myth come into play there, and how they affect the teacher-student relationship. And I think as I have grown, my perspective has also evolved a little bit. And in my current life, I think these types of microaggressions exist perhaps even more vividly in the elite workforce and schools that I have been in. But also in terms of these terms such as model minority myth, I've come to understand it not just in terms of how I describe it in the book, which is how other people see the Asian American community and how that affects us, but also how we see ourselves. So I think very much currently, as we talk about the Asian American hate crime rise, we look a lot at the model minority myth in terms of, how we have perhaps as an Asian American community learned to either survive or fit in to the US, and how that has manifested in, perhaps our being either complacent or aspirational to the model minority myth and being okay with it, and, showing that if we are okay with it, then that manifests itself in missing opportunities to stand up for other minority groups, but also stand up for ourselves. I think Jeremy Lin recently posted on his Instagram account something that said, this generation of Asian Americans are different. They're not okay with things as they are anymore. They're starting to speak up more. And I'm really hoping that this is true, and that we're starting to break this down. And then I think the other thing that has changed or perhaps evolved since I was in high school is that, I think I talk a lot about how as Asian Americans, we're not a monolith. There are so many different types of Asian Americans, and we all have very, very different experiences. And at the time, because I was very adamant about not conforming to the Asian American stereotype and fighting against that, I think I was not as, I would say, comfortable with my Asian American identity as I am today. I think I find a lot of pride and joy in being a part of the Asian American community. And I think being more actively involved in it has made my life, and I would say, in terms of activism, everyone's lives more powerful. And so I think that is another way that it's evolved over time.
So Emily, we introduced the model minority concept that some may not be familiar with. So could you very quickly explain the concept? Mm-hmm.
Sure. The model minority concept, and I think others on this call would definitely have their perspectives as well. But the way I interpret it is, as a minority, I think we are very much seen as people who are nice, quiet, gentle, conforming to the norm, following directions, and then also in terms of academics, very high achieving, good at math, good at music, those types of things.
Thank you. So with that, being Asian American in today's society, how does that shape your identity? And how do you navigate working, living, and playing in the community?
Sure. I think I've had an interesting experience working in the community because the early part of my career was actually in Asia. I spent 4 years working in Japan. So I had an experience being the American in Asia and then coming back and being the Asian American. And currently, I would say, working in an industry that is predominantly white and has a long history of racism, which is agriculture. I work in agriculture. I think being Asian American shapes very much how I feel and how aware I am of my Asian American identity from a day-to-day basis. So I think very much in a lot of meetings at work, I'm the only Asian American. And earlier today, we were actually talking in the Asian resource group at work how to get an executive sponsor, and realizing that there weren't any Asians in leadership and that being a barrier. So I think it permeates in my everyday life in terms of just my awareness of my identity. But I think the other thing is that I, as I mentioned, have started becoming a lot more active within the Asian American community. I feel that as I feel that I'm more and more of a minority in my life as an Asian American, finding those connections and finding the other Asian Americans has been really powerful for me, and it helps me find a sense of solidarity and helps me find friends in the community. And then I would say, lastly, I think I feel a large responsibility to be informed, to act, and to look both inward and outward. I think in terms of being informed, I'm a really huge advocate of Next Shark. I think Next Shark is a great publication. And I recently went to policy school, where the Asian American community there is very active in sharing articles and readings and resources. But I think in terms of work, as an Asian American who is in middle management, I've realized that there's a lot of people watching. I think there are a lot of entry-level people who are Asian American, and they often ask me what types of barriers I've faced at work and how I've overcome them. And as somebody who has not overcome them, I find that I have a real responsibility to be able to show that there is a path for someone like them. And then I think inwards towards the community as well, I think I feel a responsibility to, be active in learning how to improve as a community. I think very much in our community, we can do better in terms of lessening hatred amongst different ethnicities and different income levels. But also, we have a lot of negative sentiment towards other minorities. For example, specifically, anti-Black sentiment is very prevalent in the Asian American community, and I think being aware of that, knowing that we have to break that down, and knowing that we have to work in solidarity, I think is really important.
I love it. So much information. And I'm sure that the audience has a lot of questions for us. So I wanted to make sure that Sam has time to share his perspectives before we open it up for Q&As. So last but not least, I would like to bring Sam into the conversation. Sam, you contributed an essay in the book, Politics Runs in the Family. So can you talk about how has the political landscape changed for Asian Americans in Michigan since you wrote the book 6 years ago? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, the book was published 6 years ago, but as Emily mentioned, many of us wrote our chapters 15 years ago. And so it's interesting, during that period of time, even from writing it to when it was published, a lot had changed in that period of time as well. So very quickly, my parents immigrated in the 1960s from India to to Michigan. My father was an engineer at Ford Motor Company. And so me and my brother grew up in Southeast Michigan. Both of us ended up going to Michigan State. And I ended up staying at Michigan State University and got very actively involved in service learning activities, working with community nonprofit organizations. And that really got me interested in getting involved in politics. I ended up running for city council as a student while I was at Michigan State University. I didn't win the first time, but 2 years later, I ran again and got elected and served on the city council. And during that time, I couldn't find anybody of Asian background that was involved in local government in an elected sort of capacity. Fast forward 10 years, I got elected mayor of the city of East Lansing, and there were now a couple people that were now on a school board or maybe a county commission seat and so forth, but really not a lot. And so, it's been one of those challenges for me, and I wrote in my chapter is that because I was one of the few people of color from the Asian American community, I was often asked, to represent the Asian American community. It's a very large group, a very diverse group. And, like, what should we be doing to get more engagement in politics and so forth? And I was very uncomfortable with that at first because, I felt like, hey, I only know about me. I don't know about, the larger community and how can I represent it? Within the Indian American community specifically, I would often have reporters call me up and say, hey, this is happening in India. What is your perspective on it? And, sometimes I would know and have a perspective, and other times I wouldn't, because sometimes you're removed from the politics of your parents' home country and so forth. So it was a really challenging time during those first 10 years in local office. And I left my chapter at the end saying, what will I do? I've got these people saying, oh, you should keep running. You should become, governor. You should run for the U.S. Senate. You could be our voice. And I felt a lot of burden during that period of time. And so I wasn't sure I was going to do that. I took 5 years off of being mayor and not involved in politics. And I eventually ran for the State House of Representatives, and I won. I was then the third Asian American to serve in the legislature. There's 148 members, and there had only been 3 in the entire history of our state. Hanson Clark and Hunyang Hopgood were the 2 others who had been there before me, and both of them had served in the House as well as the state Senate. And so one of the things I wanted to make sure is that I could bring other people into politics. And, very quickly after me, a very, bright and sophisticated community organizer, Stephanie Chang, ran for office, and many people in the broader Asian American community helped her get elected. She's now a state senator, first Asian woman to serve in the state Senate. And while I was in the House, I ended up in leadership of the Democratic caucus. And I made it my point that as I was leaving, I wanted to ensure that other people were from the Asian American community were brought forward. And I'm pleased that, there are now at least 3 other Asians in the state House, Rajiv Puri, Padma Kupa, and Shri Thanadar. And so for the first time, there's, they can actually have a meeting. It's not just one person, in one chamber. Stephanie was in the Senate, I'm in the House, that type of thing. Now there's actually 4 Asians, in state politics. And so, there's a lot has changed. It really goes back to being intentional about how we engage our community, make sure people understand how to be involved. There's been a lot of infrastructure built out. Groups like APIA Vote has gone out and done a lot of great work to register people to vote, let them understand how to be engaged in their community. Not everyone has to get elected, but we want everybody to participate. And so there's been a lot of emphasis around that over the last 15 years or so that might not have existed in the early 90s when I was getting involved and engaged. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And so a lot more on the local level, school boards and a variety of other elected offices, we're seeing that. And I think you'll see more and more people sort of rise, especially as the numbers of people are rising in the state of Michigan.
Thank you, Sam, for being one of the first to pave the way in Michigan for Asian Americans in the political arena. So I have one last question before we open it up to the audience to ask questions. There is a significant national conversation happening around racial equity in our country. How has your political experience influenced your thoughts on this national conversation?
Yeah, I think, especially when I was in the legislature, we would often hear from a lot of different community groups and organizations about the inequities that were, whether it was in funding of schools, whether it was funding in healthcare. And that conversation oftentimes was not broad. It was sort of, people coming to those of us who sort of maybe knew the issues or were more engaged with some of the nonprofit community and so forth. But I think, especially the last 2 years, and especially in this last year, the pandemic has definitely shown, very clearly the racial inequities of systems all across the board, right? We've often talked about criminal justice issues, especially with the African-American community. But I think now people are even going back and looking at history, right? And saying, oh, these laws were passed specifically to, create barriers for people to own property, for people to move into a community, to get education and so forth. And I think that larger conversation is now going to a broader mass of people. And so I do think there are now interesting allies that are coming up, especially in white America, that might not have grappled with some of these issues in the past. And I think there is a much more thoughtful conversation. At the same time, it's creating friction, right? And so we're seeing some of that friction, work its way out, especially on social media, as well as now the rise in hate crime and so forth. But I do think we need to be having this larger conversation. And so I know for us on the political side, we would often talk about this as legislators of color, and especially my colleagues who were active in the Black Caucus would often talk about it. But now we're even seeing, majority members of the legislature talking about this, making this a priority and so forth. And so I do think the conversation has changed, and it's a unique opportunity for us to maybe right some very historical barriers that were created within policy, and hopefully we can be part of that change.
Thank you so much, Sam, for bringing us to a very strong closing. So at this time, I will open up to participants who may have questions. You can either type your question in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself so that we can engage in a conversation. So if you would like to ask your question directly, raise your hand or just unmute yourself. There is a question in the box, so I'm going to start with that. And then the rest, feel free to unmute yourself. So the first question that we have here is, what can non-Asian Americans do to help bring awareness to the struggle Asian Americans face?
Would you like us to respond?
Sure, yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think it's really important that we bring together a collective voice, whether you're Asians, whether you're non-Asians, regardless of your race. I think when you see injustice, it's really important that we bring that collective voice together, because it'll send out a stronger message. So non-Asians can play a huge role in this, in whatever platform you may have or whatever connections you may have, speak up.
Thank you. That is so true. A united front. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just say, listen, there's a lot of conversations that are happening, throughout, communities, whether it's as local as, within your school board or maybe your township, or these larger conversations that are happening, more at a national level and so forth. So I think, being engaged in that, and especially if a person is, part of the majority, making sure that you're learning about some of these historical inequities that were created, the barriers that were there, understanding what that history is, sharing that history. And then as the voices come to say, hey, what can we do to make those changes, amplify those voices, allow those voices to get heard and seen. And I think oftentimes, there are conversations that people are more familiar with, especially, when you look at civil rights, there's sometimes a better understanding of some of the issues that have been put before, whether it's the African American community or others, but oftentimes the Asian American community is just not that well known or understood. And so there are different issues that have happened over the years, and learning about those and amplifying those would be a really helpful part of the process.
And since Sam mentioned history, right, I would say also, look at the historical examples of, Asian American activists, right, that have negotiated these multi-generational, multi-racial, multi-ethnic lines, right? Suk has Grace Lee Boggs' chapter in her book, and I assign, Grace's work to students, right, who, tremendous impact across lots of different lines, right? In class this week, because this issue did come up, I Grace, Kushinama, right? I met Filipino side Larry Leong, right, and his work with farm workers across labor lines. Philip Veracruz, right? And then, if you want to go to a college example, the Third World Liberation Front, right? Kind of all examples of, Asians organizing with other groups across other lines to, like as Suk said, make those voices heard, right? And those are, don't need to be the one-note historical person on this panel, but those are important historical lessons, right, for us to learn from. Not that we're locked into that, but, in some respects, some of the issues are new, but in other respects, some of the techniques, some of the ways that people have worked through this, we can stand on the shoulders of giants.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I see a few more questions in the chat box. Bing, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Connie. Sam, I'm really interested, that also maybe follows to the previous question, because non-Asians can be helpful to us, but non-Asians, the way they can help us is to affirm what we are arguing for, because oftentimes the non-Asians have a good heart and a desire, but they don't know the history. And if you don't know the history, it's hard to be a strong advocate. So non-Asians, please take what our stories are as truth and so affirm those stories as well. My specific question to you, Sam, I'm wondering what advice you can give the APA community in terms of being made available to be appointed to department directors positions. I mean, I don't know, at this point, if there are any. I mean, I think I was probably the only one in Governor Snyder's administration that was Asian American and that was appointed to a director's position in his administration. How do we get ourselves to be known and to be viewed as candidates for cabinet positions? I think that some of us don't like to campaign and try to get elected, but we have talent and we have perspectives and we have a lot of the things that can enrich our states, but yet we don't have either the financial resources or the desire to do campaigning. How can we get our names in front of the decision makers to appoint us to those key influential decision positions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to first start off and just say to anyone that, being involved and engaged is often, you need to actually sign up, right? So, first, even at the local level, there's boards and commissions at every level for people to be involved in. These aren't necessarily paid positions, but you can be involved and engaged in almost any part of local government as well as state government in that kind of capacity. Big, your question more is about the paid positions that run these larger departments. And as a former appointee of a governor, you understand that sometimes it is the relationships that you have, and sometimes people do get those relationships because they've worked on campaigns and they sort of got to know people in that realm. But there's always a transition team that, gets put together. And oftentimes people get pulled in to run these departments that never even donated a dollar or did not even, weren't even involved in the campaign and so forth. And so, I think there are, what I would suggest is that, people need to look at those who want to serve within state government or maybe the federal government. I think I've seen a significant number of Asian Americans appointed to this administration, the Biden administration. But, I think you're right. In, the Whitmer administration, we probably could do a better job. And so I do think it's part of like getting to know those people that are on that transition, making sure that the Asian American people that are already in departments, especially that are in high level positions within the department, get highlighted to say, hey, maybe we don't have to go find somebody from another state to bring them in. Maybe, the person who's the deputy director could get moved up. And so I think those are a lot of opportunities, but I do think we need to make sure that those people that are the best in transportation, the best in education, that we're highlighting those individuals throughout the process. So when a new governor comes on board and is looking at those types of assignments, that team is aware of who they are. And then even though the team might be already set, every administration, it doesn't matter, every couple years, there is churn because people get other positions, people want to move on. And so we just have to have that bench ready and so forth. And so I think it's going to require some work, but that would be my advice.
Alrighty. Okay, so we are running very close on time here. We may only have time for 2 more questions. So the next one I have here is from Curtis Jin. Curtis, I don't know if you want me to ask or you want to unmute and ask.
Hey, thanks, Connie. I can do this fast. One of the key hallmarks of the Vincent Chin case was how it energized or politicized a bunch of Asian Americans who typically weren't engaged in the political process. So my question to the panelists and Connie yourself is that, have you guys noticed if the rise in hate crimes have similarly, motivated people to speak out more? Or do you find that it's still just the usual activists who are talking about these issues?
I definitely think that I've noticed an increase in awareness and activism from Asian Americans. I think you are most painfully aware probably that, as we all know, this is not new. But I think this is the first time where I've seen a lot of Asian American celebrities come out and speak, and not the ones that are most politically involved. So I guess not necessarily only the journalists, but very much so the actors and actresses, I think, have come out and spoken a lot more. I would also say that because we are in some ways fortunate to come at the heels of the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think we have seen that it's easier in some ways to speak about racial issues in places that would normally have been a little bit more taboo, or people would have been more cautious. So in my workplace, for example, we are now going to do a panel for the entire company with the Black Employee Resource Group to talk about Asian American hate crimes, which I don't think would have ever happened before. And I think the other thing is we've also started a book club, and we most recently read Minor Feelings by Kathy Hong. So I think these are things that, we would probably never have brought up before and are starting to bring up now. I hope that it doesn't lose momentum in the future, but hopefully this is the start of a conversation.
Absolutely. I just want to share that a couple of days ago, I watched on the Washington Post Live an interview of Danielle Kim and Danielle Wu about the recent attacks, and I do have the recorded interviews. So if any of you would like to receive a copy, send me an email, and I will be happy to forward it to you. It is 2:00, and
Connie, can I ask one question, Connie?
yes,
I know that oftentimes in our culture we don't confront the issues head on, because really the answer to the question, Curtis, is really nothing has happened within the Asian American community. I don't see, at least in West Michigan, I don't see us actively denouncing, actively protesting the increase in hate crimes against Asians. I think that's, I just don't see it. Yes, we see a couple of celebrities going out there and speaking up, but if you're asking the question, how has this, pushed the Asian American community to become more active in this thing? I don't, at least in West Michigan, I don't see much of that. So, I hope we can be honest about that. And I think we do need to become more active in different ways, but at least here in this region, in this side of the state, I don't see an increase in activities against Asian hate crimes.
Yes, I do agree with you on that, Bing. We need to be more actively do more with social activism. I want to say that the Asian students from Grand Valley State University are planning a RISE conference in mid-March, and anti-racism against Asian Americans is one of the topics of the conference. So I will be sending out information on that soon. It is 2:02. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I don't know how you all feel about this, but I would like to bring this to a close. I see that we do have some questions, so I can take those questions and share with the speakers and get back with you. But thank you so much, Suk, Sam, Emily, and Joe, for sharing your time with us. And thank you all for attending. The book can be purchased at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So if you have time, please check it out. And at this time, I would like to bring the event to a close. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Connie.
Yep. Bye now.
Thank you, everybody.